Faster than a speeding bullet.
I ran until my muscles burned and my veins pumped battery acid.
More powerful than a locomotive.
An idea is like a virus. Resilient. Highly contagious.
Able to leap tall buildings at a single bound.
Hey guys, Jared Moon here from Into 3 Fitness, and welcome to the Better Humanology podcast. Today we have Scott Nelson. So Scott Nelson is a co-founder of Joovv, which is a light therapy company, the first company to develop a full-body light therapy device designed for convenient in-home use. So prior to starting Joovv, Scott spent his entire professional career in leadership positions with some of the largest medical device companies in the world, including Medtronic, Covidien, Boston Scientific, and C.R. Bard. Scott is best friends with his wife, Liz, and loves spending time with his 4 kids. Now, what we talk about is not so much about his company, Joovv, which is a great company, great device, but we talk a lot more about the science behind light therapy, or more specifically, the buzzword I've heard a lot around podcasting health circles is photobiomodulation, which sounds crazy. It's a mouthful, but really photo means light, bio means life, and modulation means change. So not very complicated once you really break down that word. But we do talk about a lot of different wavelengths of light, how to use light for different things like athletic recovery, improving your skin, a lot of different things that light can do. And he gets into the real nitty-gritty science of it all, and also how you could use it in a day-to-day basis to improve your life. I think it's really cool. Photobiomodulation is a pretty awesome tool in your toolbox that you could add to become a better human. So listen to Scott. We spend a lot of time just making sure, we provide the best information around light therapy, and this guy knows his stuff. So without any further ado, let's just listen to Scott from Joovv on photobiomodulation. All right, Scott, welcome to the Better Humanology podcast, man. I'm super pumped to have you here today.
Awesome. Yeah, no, excited for our chat, and looking forward to discussing the importance of light.
Yeah, it's going to be really cool. And I haven't really gone deep on this topic on the podcast yet, so it's awesome that we have you on. But before we get into that realm, let's start off with some challenges for myself and everyone else listening. If you could kick us off with a fitness challenge.
A fitness challenge. So I'm gonna steal an idea from a buddy of mine, Joe DeStefano, who's the director of sport for Spartan Racing, and he actually gave this tip to me. Gosh, it's probably been a couple months ago, and I've eased into it. But in order to, he's a big believer in breath work. It's one of the things that he focuses on with a lot of his clients, as well as just like his daily work. And so he mentioned this technique. I think if my memory serves me right, it dates back to like ancient Greece, I think. It's a parlay into like the whole aspect of like Spartans in general. But anyway, he said whenever going on a walk, and ideally it's maybe even a jog or a run, get a drink of water. And hold that water in your mouth, because it really forces nasal breathing. And so I've slowly started to ease into that. But that is incredibly tough to do, especially if the aerobic exercise is a little bit more strenuous. But holding that water in your mouth really forces you to breathe, to breathe through your nose. And so that's a pretty interesting, fitness challenge, one that I found pretty helpful over the last couple months.
Yeah, I mean, anything that super practical and helping athletes or people in general focus on breath work. Now, just so I understand correctly, so like while you're jogging or whatever, are you carrying water with you and you just take a sip and continue jogging with water in your mouth? Is that how it works?
No,
it's not.
It's not a continuous sip. It's actually holding that same drink of water. Like, so basically, say I'm going to go walk, even just walking. But maybe let's get a little bit more pragmatic, and it's walking up a hill. So it's a little bit more strenuous aerobic exercise. So I'm going to actually take a drink of water and keep that same amount of water in my mouth through the whole exercise.
Oh, okay.
And so yeah. So I'm not swallowing. I'm not spitting. That by holding that water in your mouth, it forces your body to breathe. It forces nasal breathing in essence. And so it's pretty. I mean, it sounds kind of tough, but like actually when you do it, it's even harder. Just because nasal breathing really forces, diaphragm movement, when you're exercising. And so it's kind of an interesting little fitness challenge.
That's pretty cool. And what's the longest you've gone with doing that?
Oh, and not overly long. I've only been doing it or trying it out. I don't do it on a daily basis, but I've only been experimenting with it probably over the past month or so. And where we live here in Southern California, there's a pretty significant hill that I walk every morning. And so what I've done is I've gotten to a point where I can walk down the hill and then walk maybe a third up the hill with that same sort of drink of water per se, I guess, if you want to call it that. But so I'd like to. It's a goal of mine to go down, and then all the way up. Joe's good. Joe's good enough where I think he's actually done a significant mile run with that same. I don't recall how far, but he's gone. He's run for a certain amount of miles with that same sort of gulp of water to force nasal breathing. So he's much more advanced than me. But I would encourage anyone who's kind of interested in breath work or is kind of focused on that right now to try that out. It's pretty challenging.
I really like that. I just love the practicality of it. Anytime you're challenging your breathing and working out, it's very noticeable. I know something I've noticed over the years. Now this isn't for practice, just something I've noticed is if I'm ever chewing a piece of gum and then I try to start some hard cardiovascular activity, I notice that it's much harder for me to breathe. And it's because every time you close your mouth to chew that piece of gum, you're cutting off your oxygen supply for, a half second. And, I've always wondered if there was any sort of benefit to the breath work you might be getting in small amounts there. But other than that, it just sucks, which I'm sure this is very, very similar and very challenging to do. But I'm going to try it for sure. That sounds really cool.
Cool, man. Yeah. I would encourage anyone. And I'm kind of at this point now in my sort of my fitness routine where I'm much more interested in like functional fitness.
Yeah.
My wife's been a sort of she's practiced and focused on breath work for much longer than I have. And I've always sort of not dismissed it, but I was sort of taking it lightly, or lighter than I should take it. And so I've noticed some pretty interesting just changes in general, just focusing on just intentionally focusing on my breath and how I'm breathing, even throughout the day, even when I'm just working, at a standing desk, for example. So breath work is kind of one of those interesting things. And as a side note, I don't think we probably want to go too deep here, but as a side note, breath work has actually been shown to deplete deuterium levels in your body as well. And deuterium is this hydrogen atom that has an extra neutron. So it's a heavy hydrogen atom. And at the end of the day, the more deuterium you have in your body, the less ATP or the less cellular energy you can produce. And so breath work actually has been shown to decrease your deuterium levels, which is kind of interesting. So so breath work is kind of one of those interesting areas that maybe will become a little bit more of a focus for other fitness enthusiasts in the coming years.
Oh man, I see it. It's getting huge, way more popular than it was even more like 3 to 5 years ago. I feel like is when it was coming onto the scene, and now it's it's everywhere to the point where some people I think they're like quitting their fitness routines to just breathe. But it is a great practice to add to anyone's daily routine. I'm in complete agreement.
Sure.
I mean, how about a mental toughness challenge?
Yeah, so I'm a little bit of an interesting angle. So my background has always been when I spent my entire career in like the traditional medical device space. So with companies like Medtronic and Covidien and Boston Scientific, focused on products like cardiovascular stents and peripheral venous and arterial stents and atherectomy catheters and whatnot. But I've always had roles that are more commercial oriented, so sales and marketing roles. And I'm just a big believer in execution. And this next challenge would be, when it comes down to execution, I heard about this technique. It's a little bit more of a sales technique, but I think it can really apply to any sort of like routine or repetitive task that you need to do on a daily basis. Where it was like this old sales guy that at his computer he'd have a jar, like a bowl of paper clips. And he knew he needed to make a certain amount of calls or a certain amount of touches every day. And so literally for every call or every email, I can't remember exactly the story, he would literally just take one paper clip out of one bowl and put it into the next bowl. And it sounds so silly and sounds so like sounds so rudimentary, I guess, is probably the best description. But just the reason that's like so cool to me is like that a lot of times with like a lot of those things or projects that we're working on over the course of weeks or months, they require that sort of diligent execution. And I just like the simplicity of that, of like every call or everything that I have to do to make this project go live. I'm taking one clip from one bowl and putting it in the next. And at the end of the day, I can see how many paper clips, I added to the next bowl. And, you don't have to use paper clips, but I think you kind of get the hint that diligent execution and, forcing yourself to kind of look at the two bowls at the end of the day and how far what type of progress you made. I think that's kind of just an interesting take on sort of those rudimentary tasks that sometimes we like to avoid.
I think that's cool, man. Having a visual representation of what you're doing is really awesome. Something I did a long time ago with our athletes is anytime they did like an incredibly hard workout, like, one that you're going to remember, I challenged them to like get an actual brick and build this wall over time, of every time you had a hard workout. We called it building your wall. But then, I had to teach people how to be masons and stuff. So we kind of stopped doing it. But I love the visual representation, the paper clips. I think it keeps you motivated and keeps you going for seeing how far you've come and what you need to do next.
Yep.
All right, man. How about a book recommendation? Are you a big reader?
I am. I've got 4 kids, and we're running a startup company, so time is always limited. But I am a big book guy, and it's kind of interesting. I'm also a big fan of podcasts too, and so even dating back to I've hosted a sort of a side podcast dating back to like 2009, I think. So I'm kind of a little bit of a podcaster OG, but I love listening to podcasts via audio. But like when it comes to books, I'm not the biggest fan of listening to books via audio. I prefer not even a Kindle. I prefer actually to read the hard copy of the book. But to answer your question, one of the more recent books that there's kind of like the classics, right, that I think a lot of people kind of refer to, but I'll probably bring up a little bit more of a recent read, which is Lost and Founder by Rand Fishkin. Rand is the founder of Moz.com. It used to be SEO Moz. And I'm kind of a tech guy a little bit. Like I love apps, especially when it comes to like, digital marketing apps. And Moz has always been like one of those companies that has been really interesting to follow as they've built up. And Rand has since left the company that he founded, but he's always been one of those very genuine, authentic, transparent guys. Very smart too. And so anyway, I would, if you're into startups, and you're into, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be, tech-based or digital-based startups, but Lost and Founder is a great book. Very, very authentic, very transparent look at the startup life.
Yeah, so is that what he goes through? Just kind of what his life was like, the challenges he faced and whatnot of being a part of a startup or founding a startup?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's his, and he's got a very interesting background on how they built up Moz. So it's a unique story in and of itself. But he also provides a very, very genuine and transparent look into all of the challenges they faced. And Moz is kind of a classic. They're based in Seattle, so I'd say Silicon Valley, but they're kind of a classic, tech startup in the fact that they raised, I think, 2 or 3 rounds of financing. So they had venture capital partners, and so he kind of goes through all of it in a very transparent way. So it's a great book if you're into that sort of stuff.
That's awesome, man. And well, let's get into your background. And I mean, you mentioned kind of your background in sales and marketing and medical devices and whatnot, but give us the full background, man, of how you started out and got all the way to where you're at with Joovv today.
Sure. Yeah. And before we go too deep with my background, I want to, like, if you're listening to this, I mean, we'll eventually get into like the importance of light and what that means, from a physiological standpoint, but also from a mental standpoint, et cetera. And it sounds very, very woo-woo. Like this maybe is not going to apply to you. But I would encourage everyone to hold on to that thought. Just because I was in the very same boat. And the only reason I mention that is because it kind of parlays into our story. I was very, very cynical when my wife and her sister actually first started, they actually had purchased a light therapy package at a local med spa when we still lived in Minneapolis, and we were based in Minneapolis just because that is one of the, I mean, it's the Silicon Valley of medical devices. There's a lot of big medical device players in the Minneapolis area, and so that's actually why we lived in Minneapolis at the time. And so yeah, they both, my wife and her sister, had purchased these, I'm using air quotes here for everyone that's listening, red light therapy packages at a local med spa, and so they actually saw really good results, primarily for their skin, which really kind of what they were after. But they saw really good results. But having to go to a spa 4, 5, 6 times a week is a pretty big time commitment. Most people are going to give up after the first 4 to 6 weeks, and also it's not overly friendly when it comes to your budget. And so to kind of fast forward, my sister-in-law, my wife's sister, tried to convince her engineer husband, Justin, to actually build a sort of a device that their family could use at home, so they could experience the same benefits without having to go to a med spa on a consistent basis. And so after a bunch of experimenting, Justin eventually kind of built what was our first prototype back in mid 2015. And we had no intention to start a company around this at all. But, during that process of him trying to build out prototypes, I started looking at the science of light therapy, and it's in clinical literature, it's referred to as photobiomodulation. And I was blown away. I mean, I was very, very skeptical, as I mentioned before, of light therapy. It sounded way too woo-woo for my liking. And because I was very used to like very kind of traditional stuff, like I said before, cardiovascular stents, peripheral stents, efficacy of how long we can keep a vessel open, and what that means to a patient, et cetera. So this red light, using light as a therapy sounded way too out there. And so, but after digging into the science, I was blown away. And on that note, there's over 200 published double-blind, placebo-controlled trials on photobiomodulation, and that's almost unheard of when you look at other therapies in medicine. To have that much published research, it was is pretty compelling. And so I was kind of blown away by the therapy. And then as we started, we kind of put our heads together. We looked at what's available. What is there a device that you can use at home that delivers the right wavelengths of light, and enough power that is clinically relevant. That's at somewhat of an affordable price, where you didn't have to go to these commercial practices or spas or practitioners on a consistent basis. And so what we found is there really wasn't anything. You kind of ended up with two different ends of the spectrum. Most products on the market were very small, could treat only a very small area of your body. And in most cases were very underpowered. So you'd have to use them forever. I mean, we're talking about 3-4 hours a day, which no one's going to do in order to see results that mirrored the clinical data. On the flip side, you had these massive LED beds that were super expensive. I mean, we're talking 6 figures, over $100,000, which, most people, unless you're uber wealthy, are not going to put in your home, nor have the space to have in your home. And so we sort of saw these major gaps in the marketplace, kind of around the concept of delivering medical grade or clinically relevant power over a broad treatment area. And so we thought, well, this is interesting. It's a newer therapy, but there seems to be kind of some gaps here in the market. And so we kind of went down this path of, Justin, my brother-in-law, he's an engineer, started developing, went from prototype to a little bit better prototype. And then we ended up launching our very first product in early 2016. And ever since then, it's been kind of an interesting ride as more and more sort of health influencers have begun to adopt, light as a therapy.
That's a pretty cool story, man. I think, and what you guys have done too is you're talking about all those other studies. When I was first introduced to red light therapy, I almost dismissed it right away, kind of like you're saying, but it was probably around 2015. But the reason I did was because it was being communicated to me as like a beauty treatment, right? You're talking about the local spa or whatever. I think they're like, hey man, you really should check out red light therapy. And I think I did like a quick, like I didn't dive into it like you did and I should have. But I was just like, what? I'm not trying to, head to the spa with red light therapy or whatever. So I just kind of like stopped checking into it, and then it came onto the scene. Seems like in a major way. I think in large part to what you guys have done at Joovv. And why do you think, or do you feel like that part has been overlooked? And what I'm talking about is the benefits it has on athletic performance and recovery, and I mean, to be honest, all different areas of health.
Yeah. You're dead right in the sense that if you're familiar at all with light therapy, it's usually, and I don't want to come off as or I don't want to paint too broad of a or paint with too broad of a brush here, but it's usually women, and it's usually women that have gone to a spa that have heard about light therapy, and it's in and it typically has this connotation that it's only good for skin. It's kind of an aesthetic sort of therapy or aesthetic sort of treatment. But the reality is, when you look at the published clinical data, the benefits are so wide ranging, way beyond just skin benefits. Everything from muscle recovery to increased performance from an athletic standpoint, to nerve regeneration, to reduced pain and inflammation, to increased testosterone production. There's so many benefits, and there's loads of published clinical research to support all of these benefits. And so to kind of come full circle on why does it have this connotation that it's just good for skin? I don't really know, other than it's still a relatively new therapy, and it's only sort of been positioned in the marketplace as that. And I think we're one of the first companies to say, wait a second, this actually, because of the mechanism of action, this is a very good health tool in general. Yeah, you get all of these wide-ranging benefits, but at the core, this is helping the cells of your body, every single cell of your body, produce more energy, produce more ATP. And so everyone should be exposing themselves to more of these beneficial wavelengths of light on a daily basis. And so I don't know why. I think that's probably my take on why it hasn't been, why it's not more well known, sort of in the beyond just sort of like for the skin benefits. But we've got a ton of professional athletes, a lot of kind of well-known health influencers using our products, people like Dr. Mercola and Dave Asprey and Ben Greenfield and these types of folks, but also, more mainstream professional athletes, everyone from like Von Miller with the Broncos, Keenan Allen with the Chargers here in Southern California, Devon Kennard, trying to think of some others, Patrick Peterson with the Arizona Cardinals. So like a lot of like more main, TJ Dillashaw, who holds the bantamweight in the UFC, the bantamweight title in the UFC right now. So a lot more mainstream athletes are using light therapy because, it's when you look at the science, as we kind of chatted about, there's so much science and evidence to support that it works, that it's kind of hard to ignore once you're exposed to it.
And do you stumble across any other misconceptions people might have about red light therapy? Or actually, before we go there, let's get photobiomodulation out of the way. If you could explain that, because I think we've mentioned it a few times, but I think we should explain it a little bit more. Let's start there.
Yeah, sure. So, it's most often people hear about this as it's described as red light therapy or infrared therapy, maybe sometimes LED therapy. If you actually do PubMed searches, sometimes you'll see the acronym LLLT, which stands for two things. Some people say it stands for low level laser therapy. Other people describe it as low level light therapy. So there's several acronyms, but when you talk to a photomedicine researcher, someone like Dr. Michael Hamlin, who's on our scientific advisory board, he's a PhD at Harvard in the School of Dermatology. It's widely kind of known as the broader umbrella is referred to as photobiomodulation, and in essence, it's the study of how certain wavelengths of light impact our bodies at a physiological level. So that's kind of what we're talking about. But at a very high level, these certain wavelengths of light, and we can certainly get into the weeds if you want to, but at a high level, our bodies respond to certain wavelengths of light in pretty unique ways. And the analogy I typically like to use is, most people, especially those that are listening to your show, are going to be familiar with how how your body responds to different macronutrients at different times of day, right? So if I eat a bunch of carbs late at night, that's typically not good. Proteins versus fats and how our bodies metabolize those different macronutrients. Well, in the same sort of fashion, our bodies do the same thing with different wavelengths of light especially during different times of day. And so more specifically, red and near infrared wavelengths have been probably studied the most and have been shown to have the ability to actually help our cells, specifically the mitochondria in our cells, produce more ATP, or more cellular energy. And because of that core mechanism of action, that's why you see like this almost unbelievable, too good to be true list of benefits, right? Everything from muscle recovery to reducing joint pain, to increasing testosterone production, to healthier skin and collagen production, et cetera. But that's why. It's because almost every cell in our body has mitochondria and produces ATP. And so that's sort of what light therapy is at a high level. And if you want, we can certainly get into, some more granular details, but you let me know how deep you want to go here.
I'm good for getting into the weeds, because I think to get rid of some of the woo-woo feeling other people might have, I think getting into a little bit more of the details or the weeds might help everyone grasp it a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. So I will. The only caveat that I'll place on this is that we're dealing in the world of like biophysics. So it's not like this can be. It's not like there's just absolute 100% dead clear, definitive guidance around the mechanism of action, because there are some different things happening at a cellular level, but most photomedicine researchers tend to agree that the core mechanism of action of light therapy comes down to you have to view it in light of cellular respiration. And the 4 phases of cellular respiration, number 1 is glycolysis, number 2 is pyruvate oxidation, number 3 the citric acid or Krebs cycle. And then the 4th stage of cellular respiration is oxidative phosphorylation. And that's really kind of where the magic happens with light therapy. And so when you think about how our cells are supposed to function, during oxidative phosphorylation, there's this different enzymes are being reduced and oxidized, especially during this last phase of cellular respiration. It's largely a phase of enzymes being oxidized. And so what you end up having is this, if you hearken kind of back to your high school biology classes, you have what's called the electron transport chain during the 4th phase of cellular respiration, where these enzymes are passing through this membrane, and electrons are being transferred through the electron transport chain. And so basically you have this wall, and on each side of the wall, the goal is to have a charge gradient. So on one side you have a bunch of electrons, and on the other side you have a bunch of protons, and through that gradient you get the production of ADP, adenosine diphosphate, where that's converted into ATP, and most people probably that are listening are somewhat familiar with ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, which is cellular energy. And so that's how our cells are supposed to function. You want this charge gradient. And so but what happens, especially when our cells produce too much inducible nitric oxide, that enzyme has a tendency to bind to other enzymes, and so you don't get these electrons that spin off. Because you have enzymes that are binding in the wrong ways. And so you don't get as much of a charge gradient, and your cells then can't perform the normal functions. They can't produce the same amount of ATP. And one enzyme in particular that tends to bind fairly prevalent fairly often with inducible nitric oxide is this enzyme called cytochrome C oxidase, or CCO. And CCO actually has an affinity towards red and near infrared light. And so when our bodies get enough of red and near infrared light, those photons of energy actually help to break the bond between CCO and nitric oxide. So those enzymes are sort of, those bonds are broken, and then electrons can kind of spin off during that exchange and create that healthy gradient again across the electron transport chain. And the end result is that our cells then produce more ATP, or more cellular energy. So that's kind of what's happening at a cellular level. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I think I was following along. I was taking some notes in my notebook, but yeah, it makes sense. And so I want to go back to, you're talking about different types of light. Our body's responding to different types of light during different times of the day. What different types of light are you talking about?
Yeah, so the actual light spectrum is very, very broad. I mean, you have everything from from very, very short gamma rays to very, very long radio waves. TV, AM, FM radio waves. So the entire light spectrum is very, 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 very broad. And what we're talking about when it comes to photobiomodulation is actually very, very narrow spectrum within the red and near infrared range. Of course, there's other visible colors of light and also very non-visible light ranges that I kind of mentioned earlier. But to kind of answer your question, our biological clock or circadian rhythm is sort of balanced based on light. And so in the morning, it's actually more ideal to actually receive some blue light in the morning to help rebalance our circadian rhythm. And then when you look at the natural sunrise and then sunset, there's a greater percentage of red and near infrared wavelengths during the morning sunrise and then during the evening sunset. And so actually, if you sort of look at sort of our ancestors and the way our biological systems have evolved, and then compare and contrast that to how we live today, it's pretty different. And so, one stat that I think maybe most people would probably find interesting is that most Americans on average spend about 93% of their time indoors now under artificial light. And that seems extremely high. But if you think about it, if you're not intentional about getting more natural sunlight, think about especially if you live in a little bit of a cooler climate during the winter months. You get up in the morning, get ready under artificial light. You have your morning commute in a car or a train or a bus or something like that has glass that blocks the light. Then you're in an office environment all day under artificial light, and then you go home, and typically the sun has already set at that time, and literally you spend your entire day without getting any sort of natural light. That's vastly different than 100 years ago. Vastly different, and our biological systems just haven't evolved to actually handle that type of stress. And so light is incredibly important. And so in that, if you kind of operate in that reality, knowing that our bodies respond to different wavelengths of light during different times of the day, and then how most of us normally live on a daily basis, it's off, right? There's a big difference there. And so that's where photobiomodulation kind of really comes into handy. It's a way to sort of, if you can't, whether it's time or other factors, if you can't get enough healthy wavelengths of light during the day, a therapy like photobiomodulation can be extremely beneficial, especially if it's powerful enough where you only have to use it for 5 or 10 minutes of the day. Giving your body a little bit of an extra charge that it wouldn't otherwise have gotten on in most days.
And why do you feel that we should have both? I guess in your product specifically, there's near infrared, right? And then there's the red light as well. Why the two together?
Yep. So I'll answer that in two ways. So it kind of comes down to two things. So that enzyme that I mentioned earlier, cytochrome C oxidase, and that enzyme has a tendency to bind to excess inducible nitric oxide. That enzyme actually responds to very specific wavelengths of light, usually in the low to mid 600 nanometer range, so visible red light, and then also in the low to mid 800 nanometer range, which is IRA or near infrared. So not far infrared, not like a sauna, but we're talking about near infrared. And so that enzyme has a tendency to respond to those specific wavelengths of light, and so you get better action, basically better electron action, so to speak, with those specific wavelengths of light. And so both sort of do the same thing. Both red and near infrared light sort of both do the same thing because of the mechanism of action that we kind of previously talked about. But the biggest difference is depth of penetration, and so visible red light tends to be absorbed pretty readily in your skin tissues, the epidermis, dermis and epidermis of your skin. And that's why it's often used for the purposes of, reducing wrinkles and reducing age spots and increasing collagen levels in your skin. Whereas near infrared light has a tendency to penetrate a little bit deeper, sometimes as deep as bone. And so that's why when you look at published research around some of the other benefits that we mentioned, muscle recovery, joint pain relief, et cetera, inflammation reduction, those studies are often using near infrared light because it does penetrate a little bit deeper into your body. But the core mechanism of action is the same at the cellular level. We're really just talking about differences in penetration.
And so let's get to kind of like some of the direct benefits. If someone's sold on photobiomodulation and they want to start therapy, like how quickly would they start seeing results? I know there are a lot of different areas they could see results, but maybe what's the first thing that they would notice, and about how long do you think it would take?
Yeah, so we kind of already mentioned like the laundry list of benefits, everything from skin health to muscle recovery to athletic performance, joint pain and arthritis, testosterone production or sexual performance, weight loss. Actually, believe it or not, there's a fair amount of clinical studies that support sort of body contouring is probably actually a better description than weight loss. So there is a laundry list of benefits. Some take probably, in most cases, everyone's a little bit different, but in most cases, those benefits take longer. There's a longer amount of time to see some of those benefits. So if you used it, depending on what you're dealing with, right? If you're dealing with something like your knee, for example, say you tweaked your knee, you would probably see benefits fairly soon, probably within maybe after your first treatment, or probably most likely after your second or third treatment. You'll probably see some noticeable differences when it comes to pain reduction, right? With something like a tweaked or sore knee, as an example. Skin health, on the other hand, tends to take a little bit longer. So some of that's because we look at our faces every day in the mirror, so it's a little bit harder to notice those subtle differences. But most clinical studies that are evaluating skin health are usually done over the course of 12 to 16 weeks. Sometimes 8 weeks, but you're usually talking about 2 to 3 months to notice significant differences in skin health. So some of these benefits do take longer to see, but others you'll notice right away. In fact, a lot of the athletes that we work with, especially when they're really focused on using light therapy, maybe in the off season, they'll notice when they're really trying to ramp up their training, they'll notice pretty big differences when it comes to recovery after training. Dr. Mercola, I'm sure most people are familiar with him. He's pretty well known in the kind of the natural health circles. That's one of the benefits that he first noticed. Like after a heavy leg training day, like the amount of lactic acid that built up was noticeably different. And he noticed that the day after a big leg day. So some of that stuff you'll notice right away. Other benefits are going to take a little bit longer.
And how long are the treatments? You said as short as 5 to 10 minutes.
Yeah, well, it kind of depends on which device you're using, and so you really want to for skin health benefits, you really. A lower powered device will probably be sufficient. But you want at least, for something like skin health, you want to at least be receiving on average, 5 to 10 joules of energy per treatment. And so you kind of have to reverse engineer, similar like how you look at your macronutrient intake. You have to sort of evaluate like how much protein, how much carbs am I getting? You kind of have to do a little bit of the same thing when it comes to light therapy, because that matters. Like how big is my dose of energy? So with skin health, it's 5 to 10 joules of energy per treatment. With something like pain reduction or muscle recovery, you want a lot larger dosage of energy, sometimes 60 to 100 joules per treatment session. And so to answer that question, it kind of depends on the device you're using. But that's one of the reasons we optimized or we designed the devices the way our devices the way we did, is we wanted a significant power output. Irradiance is actually the technical term for it, not watts, but irradiance. We wanted a significant power output so you wouldn't have to use it for very long. And so like with our devices, because at the recommended treatment distance, you're getting about 100 milliwatts per square centimeter, that equates to about 6 joules on average per minute. And so with a treatment time of like 10 minutes, you're getting a very clinically relevant dose of energy in less than 10 minutes. And so, that's why generally speaking for, with most of the people that buy our devices, we recommend, about a 10-minute treatment time on a daily basis, or at least, 4 to 5 times a week to see noticeable benefits.
And is there such thing as too much time?
Yeah, it's a great question. I wouldn't say light therapy is one of these arenas where there really isn't any there's very, very little downside risk, if any at all. Especially if you're asking for like proven downside risk, there really isn't I always have a caveat is like it's hard to be like totally 100% definitive, but it's one of those interesting therapies where it's like, can you drink too much water? Well, I mean, I guess if you're super, super extreme, you probably.
Right.
But light therapy is kind of one of those therapies where it's like there's not a whole lot of downside risks. But I would say you probably reach a law of diminishing returns because your cells need a certain amount of recovery time. And so, yeah, probably like with a high powered device like ours, probably anything beyond 15 minutes per treatment area is probably enough. Anything after that, you're not going to receive a whole lot of added value, and so it's more of an issue of a law of diminishing returns versus negative downstream ramifications of using it too much.
And how do you feel about was it far infrared? The more that kind of wavelength and saunas and things like that versus photobiomodulation and red light therapy and all that.
Yeah, and you kind of mentioned this earlier. Is like what are the common myths or the common questions around light therapy? One of them is we touched on this earlier. Is it's just for skin health, which I think by now hopefully most of the people that are listening have overcome that myth. The other one would be well, this is the same thing as like a far infrared sauna. And it's not. And so, I mentioned this earlier that different wavelengths of light, just like different macronutrients, carbs, proteins, et cetera, have different, our bodies metabolize those in different ways. It's the same thing with different wavelengths of light. And so far infrared wavelengths do something different on a physiological basis than light than the wavelengths of light that we already discussed. And so when it comes to light therapy versus like heat-based or sauna-based therapy, both are great. They're just very different in terms of the mechanism of action. And a lot of saunas nowadays utilize far infrared wavelengths primarily because those generate the most heat. And that's the end goal with the sauna is you're trying to heat your body. You're trying to induce heat stress on your body, induce heat shock proteins. And there's benefit in how your body responds to that heat stress. That's very different from a mechanism of action standpoint than light therapy or photobiomodulation. With photobiomodulation, the goal is not to induce heat stress. Instead, the goal is to deliver very specific wavelengths of light to help your cells produce more energy. So it's very recovery oriented versus sauna therapy is great, but it's just very different in the sense that you're trying to induce a certain amount of stress on your body. So two very good therapies, but just drastically different. So to answer your question at a high level, yeah, far infrared wavelengths are very, very different than near infrared and red wavelengths.
And I want to go a little bit further if you have any more about any other misconceptions that you might know or maybe we haven't hit on, just light therapy in general or anything else.
Yep. Yeah. So another one that comes up is when it comes to like light therapy in general. If you go to like a local Home Depot or local home improvement store, Lowe's, Home Depot, whatever. Sometimes you'll see these infrared heat lamps, right? It's the incandescent lamps that you kind of screw in, and they're pretty bright, but more so they're very hot. They get very hot after a certain amount of time. That's not light therapy. And the reason for that is those specific sources, those heat lamps, those incandescent bulbs, they produce a very wide spectrum of wavelengths, right? So because they produce a very wide spectrum of wavelengths, you're getting a very low percentage of the clinically efficacious wavelengths, the ones that we already spoke about, the wavelengths in the low to mid 600 nanometer range and in the low to mid 800 nanometer range. So infrared heat lamps, they produce such a wide variety of spectrum. That's one of the reasons they get so hot, because they actually produce a fair amount of far infrared wavelengths because they generate a decent amount of heat. And then also they're relatively, even though the wattage is very high, most of them are 250 watt bulbs. They're very, very inefficient. And so they actually don't produce the necessary amount of irradiance that you need either. And so we kind of talked about this earlier a little bit. And in the sense that, like, when you look at a very good light therapy product, you want to see pretty high irradiance levels, anywhere from at least 50 milliwatts per square centimeter, maybe, to a situation like ours where you're getting well over 100 milliwatts per square centimeter. That's kind of like the horsepower of an engine, so to speak. And so with infrared heat lamps, you're typically getting, you have to stand a little bit farther away because they're very hot. But if you're standing, roughly, 18 to 24 inches away, you're only getting, less than 10 milliwatts per square centimeter. And so theoretically they could work a little bit, but again, you have to use those for like hours and hours per day to get any sort of like clinically relevant response. And so that's kind of a long-winded answer, but yeah, infrared heat lamps is not the same thing as light therapy. That's kind of sometimes a common misconception when people start to do a little bit of research into this space. And so we've actually got a decent article, and maybe you can link to it in the show notes. We actually got a decent article, a few nice articles on our site that really go into the differences between both saunas and light therapy, as well as infrared heat lamps and light therapy, if you want to like really get into the weeds and try to understand this at another level. And so those are probably two of the more common, misconceptions that are questions that kind of come up. Another one is like what to look for in a light therapy device. Like say you're sold, you're like, hey, this sounds really interesting. I'm one of those people that doesn't get enough healthy, natural light on any sort of consistent basis. Another one would be like what to look for in a device. And it doesn't have to be overly complicated, but it probably comes down to a few core things, a few core technical, things to look for in a product. One would be which wavelengths are delivered from this device. So you want pretty specific, pretty precise wavelengths. You want to make sure that you understand that. You also want another one that often most companies unfortunately don't list out is what's the irradiance coming from this device. And so not wattage, but irradiance. You want to really look for that number. Like I said before, it's kind of like the horsepower of an engine. I mean, it's like going and buying a car and asking what the horsepower of a certain engine is, and the car sales guy says, well, I can't tell you that, or I don't know. It's kind of, at that point, you'd probably walk away. So it's kind of the same thing with light therapy devices. You want to know the irradiance because that allows you to calculate the energy dose of that you're getting in a certain treatment session. So that's really an important thing to look for. And then lastly, think about like the size of the device too, right? Like if you're just trying to treat a tweaked ankle, right? If you have tennis elbow or golf elbow or a knee, you can get away with a smaller device, but we're at Joovv, we're pretty strong believers that this type of therapy is great for every cell in your body. And so why not try to use something that delivers these wavelengths over a very broad treatment area? And so that's another key consideration.
And I guess here's another question, and this one's really simple. I'm sure you get asked all the time, and it's listed on your website. But I just want to hear your answer. Is do you need to be naked?
Yeah. So technically the answer is no. And the reason for that is if you're just treating like your elbow, well, of course you don't need to be naked. You just need to make sure that whatever area you're treating is exposed to the light. So if your goal is full body light therapy, which is the most common goal with most of our customers, well, yeah, then you're going to be naked, and most of our customers will use the device for 5 to 10 minutes after a shower in the morning, or late at night, after they get dressed or get undressed, I should say. And so whatever area of your body you're trying to treat, yes, that needs to be your bare skin needs to be exposed. But if you're trying to just treat an ankle, a sore back, whatever it is, just make sure that specific area is exposed to the light.
Awesome. All right, you ready for the quick fire questions of the show?
I am, man. Yeah, let's do it.
All right, what's the hardest workout you've ever done?
The hardest workout I've ever done, I'd probably have to date. I don't do this type of stuff anymore, but I'd have to probably go back to the summers. In my summers in high school, actually, did some pretty strenuous stuff, and I remember doing these. It was actually a football drill, and we did these. I'm trying to remember the technical name for it, but in essence, we did 300-meter sprints. So you basically run 3/4 of the track, walk the last 100 meters, and then do it all over again. And I think we did upwards like that without any rest. Your rest is the 100 meters between the sprint, and I think we did that. We got up to like 12 times in a row, and that was brutal. I remember like trying it actually relatively within the past 6 months, and I think I did maybe like 3 or something like that. And I was like, geez, hard to believe that at one point in time I was we were doing 12 of these no problem. So yeah, that's probably the most strenuous sort of thing that I remember, or that comes to mind anyway.
That does sound brutal. I mean, that's at least 3 miles worth of sprinting, which is well, I mean, including the rest, but that's pretty brutal.
Yeah. No, it's, and I'm not like, I don't do a ton of like cardiovascular, like aerobic type of work, but that in terms of like just, this is killing me, that's probably what comes to mind, comes to mind first.
All right. In your opinion, what's the best activity for building mental toughness?
Mental toughness. I would say, gosh, that's a great question. Best activity for I don't want to sound, for the sake of sounding repetitive, but I would, that technique that I mentioned at the beginning of the show, that little paperclip, transferring the paperclip, I would probably say that, because it requires just very, very diligent execution in the most rudimentary way. And if you could like do that for a week, find the most repetitive tasks and just do that for a week and just see like how many times did I actually succeed in this. That's probably the activity that probably builds the most mental toughness. And again, it probably depends on what you're tracking against. But if you're tracking against very stuff that matters but is just very routine and sort of boring, I think that builds a certain amount of like mental toughness. Grinding through some of that stuff.
And if you could only have one piece of equipment to train with for the rest of your life, what would it be?
So I'll answer that. Oh, two answers for that. So the very simple approach is I'm into like a lot of body weight stuff, like functional fitness and body weight stuff. So most of the stuff I do anymore is body weight oriented. So I would say technically I don't need anything, just because a lot of times I'm just using body weight. But the one piece of equipment I would probably say kettlebells. You can do so much with kettlebells. And I'm certainly no expert when it comes to kettlebell training, but for such like a core sort of tool, I guess, or core piece of kind of equipment, and the broad range of things that you can do with those, I would say my answer would probably be a good old fashioned kettlebell.
Awesome, man. Nothing wrong with that. Kettlebell, you can get a lot done.
No doubt.
All right. The question of the show: what is the best advice you have for becoming a better human? And this is 100% open ended.
I would say there's probably two things. So I'm, and some of this is just biased towards like my own things that I've sort of grown up in, over the course of the past 15, 20 years, raising kids, et cetera, trying to have trying to build a healthy marriage, et cetera. But I would say always be learning would be one. Another one I would say that sort of is aligned with that is always be curious or open-minded to certain things. Even if something sounds kind of weird up front, the fact that you're just open-minded to it, I think, are always, curious. I think that sort of mindset tends to be pretty helpful. And then, in terms of like just core being a better human, I would say, and this is, I guess somewhat aligned with the first two that I mentioned, it was just being empathetic, just always trying to intentionally put yourself in someone else's shoes, and being empathetic towards, where they're coming from and their life experience. And, that's a lot easier said than done, especially if, the other side is not, the other party is not the easiest to, get along with, so to speak. But just always trying to be empathetic, I think is just a good framework to view life through.
I love it, man. Great advice. Now, you do have an amazing product, and I want to make sure that we, discuss it, or at least tell people where they can go learn more. So what is the best place for people to learn more about the Joovv and what you guys are doing as a company and all that stuff? Yeah.
So Joovv, it's spelled Joovv. So 2 O's, 2 V's, Joovv.com. Sometimes it gets pronounced Joovy, but it's Joovv.com. J, 2 O's, 2 V's. If this what we talked about, the concept of light as a therapy and the importance of light, if that's interesting and you're kind of new to it, I would highly recommend going to the Learn section of our site, filled with a ton of articles that are all referenced by published clinical research. And each article typically has like a helpful video that sort of corresponds to the article. So if you're more of a video person, highly recommend checking out that section of our website. If you're interested, if you're like want to bypass that and are kind of just more curious as to what people are experiencing with our devices in particular, I would go to the reviews section on our site. And I think we're up to close to 400 4 or 5 star reviews on our site.
Nice.
And you can kind of see what people are experiencing in kind of their own words. So I would probably recommend going to those two areas of our site. Of course, you can if you go to the shop page, you can kind of get an idea of our our specific product offering. But the learn and the review section is pretty interesting if you're kind of interested in exploring light therapy in more in a deeper way. And the other thing that I would mention too is by the time this podcast is probably released, we'll have launched a totally refreshed version of our core products. The major changes being they're now modular in nature, and so sort of think Lego blocks. So now you can actually start with one Joovv product and actually add to it over time. So you can kind of over time build out your full body system, which is kind of cool. So if you're a little bit more budget conscious and you can't go with a bigger device right now, you can actually start with one and then build it out over time, which is pretty cool. And some of the other like really interesting kind of fun changes to our devices, they all now have built-in Bluetooth timers that allow you to change between red and near infrared light or use both at the same time. All of the devices are now Bluetooth compatible, of course. So you can control them via one touch button or through our app now, which is pretty sweet. And I think what's one of the more intriguing aspects to me personally, just because I've spent most of my professional career in the traditional medical device world, is our devices are now Class 2 cleared by FDA. And one of the reasons we sort of leveled that up from a manufacturing and regulatory perspective is we want to do a lot more clinical trials in the future. And to get IRB approval for a lot of these trials, you need to have Class 2 clearance from FDA in order to get approval from an investigational review board. And so that's kind of cool. And so it'll be interesting to kind of explore what that looks like for us as a company as we dive deeper into the world of exploring other clinical applications for light therapy.
That's huge, man. Congrats on getting that approved. That's a really big deal.
Yeah, no, we're super excited. It's something actually, quite honestly, this refreshed version is we started working on it probably within the first 2 or 3 months of our very first product launch, and so it's been a long time coming. And so it's pretty cool to finally be here.
Awesome. So you guys heard it. Go check out Joovv.com. I know I've been all over that learn section. There's a ton of great information and link to studies and videos and all sorts of stuff you guys can check out. I'll link to it in the show notes. Other than that, Scott, thank you so much for your time, and thanks for being on the Better Humanology podcast.
Awesome. Thanks a ton for the opportunity. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Your best. Losers always whine about their best.